I caught my son digging in our yard in the dead of night, bearing something I couldn't quite see from my bedroom window. I convinced myself it was just his way of coping with his messy divorce. I was so wrong. When curiosity finally drove me to investigate what he'd been hiding in our own backyard, what I uncovered made me question everything I thought I knew about my child. The person I trusted most in this world had been planning something unthinkable right under my nose. Before I dig deeper into this painful truth, please comment below and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. Trust me, this story will hit close to home, no matter where you live. My name is Aaron Pierce, and I'm 61 years old. For the past 35 years, I've built Pierce Construction from the ground up here in Phoenix, Arizona. We've put up shopping centers, office buildings, and hundreds of homes across the valley. I thought I knew everything about building something solid, something that lasts. I was wrong about a lot of things, but mostly I was wrong about my own son. What I'm about to tell you happened just 3 weeks ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It's a story I never thought I'd have to share about trust betrayal and the lengths a desperate person will go to save themselves. It's about those bottles my son buried in our backyard and what I found inside them that nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for. Caleb is my only child. He's 32, now works as a project manager at my company, and up until recently I thought he was finally getting his life together after his divorce last year. But looking back, I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way he'd avoid eye contact during our morning coffee talks. How he'd change the subject whenever I brought up the quarterly reports or asked about his personal finances. The dark circles under his eyes that he blamed on insomnia. It all started on a Sunday night in late September. I've always been a light sleeper, probably comes from years of worrying about job sites and deadlines. That particular night, something woke me around midnight. Maybe it was the sound of the back door closing or footsteps on the gravel path that runs along our pool. I got up and looked out our bedroom window, which faces the backyard. The moon was bright that night, casting long shadows across our desert landscaping. That's when I saw him. Caleb was out there in his pajamas and work boots, carrying something in his hands. A bottle, it looked like, maybe a beer bottle or something similar. I watched as he walked to the far corner of our yard near the oleander bushes my late wife Maria had planted years ago. He knelt down and started digging with a small gardening spade. The whole scene was so bizarre, so out of character for my practical, no-nonsense son that I just stood there frozen. He dug for maybe 10 minutes, placed the bottle in the hole, and covered it back up. Then he patted the dirt down, scattered some loose gravel over the spot, and headed back inside. I heard him wash his hands in the kitchen sink before going back to his room. I stood at that window for another 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Was this some kind of breakdown? Had the stress of the divorce, the pressure of working for his old man, finally gotten to him? Maybe he was having some kind of psychological episode. People do strange things when they're hurting. The next morning at breakfast, Caleb seemed normal. Tired, maybe, but he ate his eggs, drank his coffee, and talked about the Henderson project like nothing had happened. I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing, but I hadn't. And as the days passed, I found myself glancing out at that corner of the yard, wondering what was buried there under the oleanders. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he'd buried some memento from his marriage, something he couldn't bear to throw away but couldn't stand to keep in the house. I thought it was just a one-time thing. I was wrong. The following Sunday night, I found myself lying awake, replaying that strange scene in my mind. All week, I'd been watching Caleb at work, searching his face for signs of whatever was troubling him. He seemed focused, professional, as always, but there was tension in his shoulders. The way he'd check his phone constantly, then quickly put it away when anyone approached. At 11:58 that Sunday night, I heard it again. The soft click of the back door. Footsteps on gravel. This time I was ready. I positioned myself at the bedroom window, staying hidden in the shadows. My heart pounded as I watched Caleb emerge into the moonlight, carrying another bottle. This one looked different, darker glass. He walked with purpose to a different spot in the yard, about 10 feet from where he'd buried the first bottle, near the Palo Verde tree. Same small spade, same methodical approach. But this time, before burying the bottle, he pulled papers from his pocket, rolled them up and slipped them inside. Then he wrapped the whole thing in a plastic bag. This wasn't some emotional breakdown. This was planned. Deliberate. The fact that he was preserving papers inside these bottles suggested something far more serious than I'd thought. I watched him finish and head back inside, following the same routine. The hand washing. The quiet steps to his room. But this time, I didn't go back to bed. I sat in the dark living room for hours, mind racing. 2 bottles now, 2 different locations. Papers inside, at least one. What was my son hiding? Why in our backyard? The possibilities range from troubling to terrifying. Was he involved in something illegal? Gambling debts. The divorce had been expensive. His ex-wife's lawyer had been ruthless. By morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't confront Caleb directly without knowing what I was dealing with. If he was in trouble, approaching him wrong might make things worse. But I couldn't sit back and do nothing. At breakfast, I watched Caleb carefully. He looked exhausted. His hands shook slightly, reaching for the coffee pot, and when his phone buzzed, genuine fear flashed across his face before he composed himself. "You know what, son?" I said casually. "I think I might be coming down with something. Feel under the weather. I might stay home tomorrow, take a sick day." Caleb looked up, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw relief in his eyes. "That's probably smart, Dad. You've been working too hard. Rest up." After he left for the office, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at our backyard. 2 bottles buried out there containing God knows what. My son's secrets literally buried in the ground where my wife used to tend her garden. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscaping, and somewhere under that peaceful dirt lay answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Tomorrow, when Caleb left for work, I would dig up those bottles. Monday morning came faster than I wanted it to. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with possibilities of what those bottles might contain. When my alarm went off at 6, I found Caleb already in the kitchen, dressed for work and nursing a cup of coffee that looked untouched. "Morning, Dad," he said, glancing up from his phone. "How are you feeling?" I put on my best sick act, coughing a little and rubbing my temples. "Not great, son. Think I'll take that sick day after all. You can handle the Morrison site inspection without me, right?" "Of course." Caleb grabbed his keys and briefcase, moving with an urgency I hadn't noticed before. "Take care of yourself. Get some rest." The moment his truck disappeared down our street, I felt my heart start racing. This was it. No more wondering, no more speculation. Whatever my son was hiding in our backyard, I was about to find out. I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, staring out at the 2 spots where I'd watched him dig. In the morning light, they looked so ordinary. Just another part of our desert landscape with its carefully arranged rocks and drought-resistant plants that Maria had loved so much. But I knew better now. Somewhere under that innocent-looking ground were Caleb's secrets. I found an old gardening spade in the garage, the same type I'd seen him use. My hands were already trembling as I walked across the yard to the oleander bushes, where he'd buried the first bottle a week ago. The morning air was cool, but sweat was beading on my forehead. Standing over the spot, I tried to remember exactly where I'd seen him dig. The ground looked undisturbed, but when I knelt down and brushed away some of the decorative gravel, I could see subtle differences in the soil. Slightly softer earth, a few small rocks that didn't quite match the pattern of the others. I started digging carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was down there. Each scrape of the spade felt impossibly loud in the quiet morning. What if the neighbors saw me? What if Caleb came back for something he'd forgotten? About 8 inches down, the spade hit something solid. Glass. My breath caught in my throat as I cleared away more dirt, revealing the neck of a bottle. It was a beer bottle, just like I'd thought, wrapped in a clear plastic bag and sealed with tape. I lifted it out with shaking hands, brushing off the remaining dirt. Through the brown glass and plastic, I could see there was definitely something inside. Papers folded tight and stuffed down into the bottle. For a moment, I just sat there in the dirt, holding this thing that my son had buried in secret. Part of me wanted to put it back to pretend I'd never found it. Maybe some secrets were meant to stay buried, but I couldn't. I was already in too deep. I unwrapped the plastic bag and unscrewed the metal cap. The papers inside were rolled tight, protected from moisture. As I pulled them out and began to unfold them, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. The first thing I saw was a letterhead I recognized. Pierce Construction. My company. My letterhead. But the invoice underneath it was wrong. All wrong. It was made out to a supplier I'd never heard of, for materials we'd never ordered signed, with what looked like my signature but wasn't quite right. My vision blurred as I stared at the forged document. Then I saw the others. More fake invoices. Purchase orders I'd never approved, all bearing my supposedly authentic signature. What I found inside made my blood run cold. I stared at that forged invoice, my company's letterhead mocking me from the dirt-stained paper. The signature at the bottom looked like mine at first glance, but when I studied it closer, I could see the subtle differences. The way the F in Aaron curved slightly wrong. The R in Pierce, that was too angular. Someone had practiced my signature, but not quite perfectly. My hands trembled as I unfolded the next document. Another invoice, this one for substandard concrete, from a supplier called Desert Materials LLC. I'd never heard of them, but according to this paperwork, I'd allegedly ordered $15,000 worth of their cheapest grade concrete for the Henderson Shopping Center project. The same project Caleb was managing. The signature on this one was better, more convincing. Whoever had forged it was getting practice. There was more. A handwritten note supposedly in my writing detailing how to cut costs by using inferior materials and pocketing the difference. The handwriting was close enough to mine to fool someone who didn't know me well, but I could see the deception. The way I formed my A's was different. My real handwriting slanted more to the right. At the bottom of the bottle was something that made my stomach lurch. A small chunk of concrete, crumbly and weak, with a label stuck to it reading, Henderson Project, Sample A. I picked it up, and it practically disintegrated in my fingers. This wasn't the high-grade concrete we'd actually used. This was garbage, the kind of material that could cause a building to fail. But the worst part was the business card taped to the inside of the bottle. Aaron Pierce, construction contractor. It read with our company address and my phone number. Except I'd never had business cards printed with that exact layout. The font was wrong, the logo slightly off-center. Someone was building a case against me. Someone was creating evidence that I was cutting corners using substandard materials and taking kickbacks from suppliers. Evidence that could destroy my company, my reputation, and potentially land me in prison if the wrong people saw it. And that someone was my son. I sat there in the dirt holding these fabricated documents, trying to process what this meant. Caleb wasn't just having some kind of breakdown. He wasn't bearing mementos from his divorce or dealing with depression. He was systematically creating evidence to frame me for construction fraud. But why? What could possibly drive him to do something like this? The answer hit me like a physical blow. If I went to prison for fraud, if my company was shut down and my assets frozen, who would inherit everything once the legal dust settled? Who knew the business well enough to sell it off quickly, even at a loss? My son, my only child, the person I'd trusted with project management, with access to our suppliers, with knowledge of our contracts and procedures. I looked across the yard to where I'd seen him bury the second bottle. What other evidence had he planted? What other lies was he preparing to tell about me? I needed to see it all. I needed to understand the full scope of what Caleb was planning. I carefully placed the forged documents back in their plastic bag, my mind reeling. Every instinct told me to confront him immediately to demand an explanation. But I had to know what was in that second bottle first. I had to see how deep this betrayal went. Standing up on unsteady legs, I walked across the yard to the Palo Verde tree. The morning sun was getting higher, and I could feel sweat mixing with tears on my face as I knelt down and started digging again. My hands were shaking as I reached for the second bottle. The second bottle was buried deeper, and my panic made every scrape feel clumsy. When I finally hit glass, I almost sobbed with relief. This bottle was larger, a wine bottle wrapped in multiple plastic layers. Something rattled inside that wasn't papers. Back under the Palo Verde tree, I unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Along with more forged documents, there was a small black USB drive sealed in a waterproof bag. The papers were more fake invoices, but that USB drive terrified me. Digital evidence carried weight that handwritten notes never could. I stumbled back to my home office and stared at the USB drive before plugging it into my laptop. The drive contained dozens of files. Email exchanges supposedly between me and suppliers discussing kickbacks and corner cutting, bank statements showing payments to accounts I'd never opened, even audio files of conversations that sounded like me but weren't. The emails showed months of correspondence between my email address and suppliers, negotiating reduced prices for substandard materials. The writing style was convincingly mine, with phrases I actually used in business correspondence. But I'd never sent these emails. One audio file made my blood freeze. A recorded phone call between me and a concrete supplier discussing falsified inspection reports. The voice was exactly mine, every inflection perfectly mimicked. If I didn't know I'd never made this call, I would have believed it was me. The bank statements showed regular deposits into an account I'd never used payments corresponding exactly with the fake invoice dates. Someone had created a complete financial trail leading back to me. As I scrolled through file after file, a horrifying picture emerged. This wasn't just framing me for bad business deals. This was comprehensive destruction. The evidence suggested fraud going back months, involving multiple projects. If this reached authorities, I'd face serious prison time. Then I found the final file, Insurance Claim Strategy. It outlined reporting the fraudulent activities to the State Construction Board after my arrest. The plan claimed my company had been unknowingly involved in fraud, deceived by the owner's criminal activities. The document recommended selling the company quickly to avoid legal complications, preferably to someone with intimate business knowledge who could handle the transition smoothly. Someone like my son. I sat back, the full scope of Caleb's betrayal washing over me. This wasn't about money or revenge. This was calculated destruction of my life to steal everything I'd built, while making himself look like the innocent victim of his father's crimes. The timeline was clear. He'd create this evidence, then discover it, and report me to authorities. While I sat in prison awaiting trial, he'd sell the company and disappear with the proceeds. My own son was planning to destroy me. My hands had stopped shaking, but my mind raced, trying to understand how my son had become capable of something this calculated. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. Caleb's hushed phone calls, stepping away from job sites when certain numbers appeared. The way he'd grown defensive about his finances, claiming everything was under control. That $5,000 he'd borrowed last month for car repairs. The supplier invoices he claimed were already paid but never reached my desk. How long had he been planning this? How many nights had he spent creating fake emails, practicing my signature recording conversations with voice software? The cruelest part was how well he knew me. Every forged document played on my reputation for being hands-on for personally approving purchases. He'd used my own business practices against me, creating believable corruption that fit my management style perfectly. I could see his timeline now. Create and bury the evidence. Then stage a discovery while doing yard work. Play the shocked son devastated to learn his father was corrupt. Report it to authorities with no choice. While I sat in jail, he'd position himself as the reluctant heir, forced to salvage what he could from his father's crimes. The company would sell quickly below market value for fast transaction. By the time I was cleared, it would be too late. Business gone, money hidden, Caleb disappeared. Brilliant in a horrifying way, and it might have worked if I hadn't been a light sleeper. But what drove him here? Gambling debts, I was now certain, existed. Pressure of working for his father while struggling with failures or deeper resentment I'd been blind to. I remembered my pride when he joined the company after college, bragging to other contractors about keeping it in the family. Had that pride been a burden? Had working in his father's shadow made him feel trapped instead of blessed? None of that mattered now. My son, the boy I'd taught to read blueprints, the young man I'd trusted with my life's work, was planning to destroy me completely. I looked at the clock. 4:30. Caleb would be home in 2 hours, probably expecting to find me still sick, in bed, unaware his buried secrets had been unearthed. I could go to police myself, turn in the evidence, and explain my son was framing me. But who would believe such a story, a father claiming his own son was an elaborate criminal mastermind? Or I could confront Caleb directly, give him a chance to explain why he'd chosen this path. The decision was easy. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the calculated cruelty, he was still my son. I owed him that much. I owed myself the truth from his own mouth. That evening I waited for Caleb to come home. Caleb's truck pulled into the driveway at 6:15, just like every other Monday. I watched from the living room window as he gathered his briefcase and water bottle, moving with the same tired routine he'd followed for years. He had no idea that his world was about to collapse. I thought about the boy he used to be, the kid who'd follow me around job sites wearing a plastic hard hat, asking endless questions about concrete and rebar. The teenager who'd worked summers for the company, sweating in the Arizona heat, but never complaining. When had that eager boy become this calculating stranger? "Hey, Dad," Caleb called as he came through the front door. "How are you feeling? Any better?" "Much better," I said, standing up from my chair. "In fact, I think we need to talk." Something in my tone made him pause. His eyes narrowed slightly, that survival instinct that had probably served him well in whatever trouble he'd gotten himself into. "Sure," he said carefully. "What about..." I walked to my desk and picked up the plastic bags containing the evidence from both bottles. Caleb's face went white as he recognized them. "Why don't you tell me about your gardening hobby?" I said, setting the bags on the coffee table between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Caleb stared at the evidence like it might disappear if he looked hard enough. His hands started to shake. "Dad, I can explain." "Can you—" I interrupted. "Can you explain why you forged my signature on dozens of fake invoices? Can you explain why you created audio recordings of conversations I never had? Can you explain why you've been planning to send me to prison so you can steal my company? It's not what it looks like." His voice cracked like he was 16 again, caught sneaking out after curfew. "Then what is it, Caleb? What does it look like when your son buries evidence to frame you for fraud?" He sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice. I taught you that." "No, you don't get it." He looked up and I saw tears in his eyes. "I'm in deep, Dad. Really deep. The kind of people I owe money to, they don't just break your legs. They hurt your family." "How much?" 200,000, maybe more with interest. The number hit me like a physical blow. "Jesus, Caleb." "Gambling." He nodded miserably. "It started small. Poker games with friends. Then online betting. Then I found this private casino high-stakes games. I kept thinking I could win it back, that one good night would fix everything. So you decided to destroy me instead." "I was going to pay you back," he said desperately. "After I sold the company, I was going to make sure you got out of prison, hire the best lawyers. After you sold my company, after you sent me to prison for crimes I didn't commit." The absurdity of it seemed to hit him for the first time. His shoulders sagged. "I know how it sounds, but they were going to kill me, Dad. And maybe you too, just to make a point. I thought, if I could just get the money." "You thought you could sacrifice your father to save yourself." "I thought I could save us both." I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, who'd been willing to destroy my life to cover his mistakes. The worst part was that I could see the twisted logic in his plan, the desperate reasoning of someone who'd run out of options. "Caleb," I said quietly, "do you have any idea what you've done to us, to our relationship, to everything we built together?" He couldn't meet my eyes. I know, and I'm sorry, but I didn't know what else to do." The truth was about to come out. Caleb's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at me across that coffee table. The evidence of his betrayal spread between us like broken glass. "They gave me 2 weeks," he whispered. 2 weeks to come up with the money, or they'd start with my kneecaps and work their way up to you. They know where you live, Dad. They know your routine, your favorite coffee shop, everything." I sat back in my chair, the full picture finally coming into focus. This wasn't just about greed or resentment. This was about terror, about a son who'd gotten in over his head and saw only one way out. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" "Because I knew what you'd say. You'd want to go to the police, or pay them off yourself, or try to negotiate. You don't understand these people, Dad. They don't negotiate. They don't care about your reputation or your business. They just want their money, and if they don't get it, they make examples." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking more like the scared little boy I remembered than the calculating criminal I'd discovered. "I thought if I could get the money quickly, quietly, I could pay them off and disappear. Start over somewhere else. You'd be hurt for a while, maybe even hate me, but you'd be alive. And you'd be rich. I'd be broke," he shot back. "Do you think I wanted to steal from you? Do you think I enjoyed creating those fake documents, practicing your signature until my hand cramped? Every night for weeks. I sat in my apartment making evidence against my own father, hating myself more with each lie." The pain in his voice was real raw. I could see the toll this had taken on him, the weight of what he'd been planning. But I could also see something else, something that reminded me of the boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on ants. "The timeline," I said. "You were going to call the police this week, weren't you?" He nodded miserably. "Friday, I was going to discover the bottles while helping you with yard work. Act shocked, call the authorities, play the devastated son who had no choice but to report his father's crimes. And then sell the company fast, pay off the debt, and disappear before you got out on bail. I figured by the time you proved your innocence, if you ever could, I'd be long gone. You'd hate me, but you'd be alive." I stared at my son, this broken man who'd been willing to sacrifice everything we'd built together to save both our lives. The betrayal still burned, but underneath it, I felt something unexpected. Pride. Twisted, misguided pride that my son had been trying to protect me even while destroying me. Caleb, I said finally, you're an idiot. He looked up startled. You're a gambling addict who got in over his head and made the worst possible decisions at every turn. You were going to send your father to prison, steal his life's work, and disappear like a coward. His face crumpled. I know, but you're also my son. And despite everything you've done, despite this insane plan, you're still my boy. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out my checkbook. 200,000, you said? Dad, no, you can't. I can and I will, but there are conditions. What I did next surprised us both. The conditions I set that night were simple, but non-negotiable. I would pay off Caleb's debts in full, but he would leave Pierce Construction immediately. No severance, no gradual transition. He would clean out his desk the next morning and never return. More importantly, he would enter gambling addiction treatment and prove he was serious about changing his life. If he relapsed, our relationship would be over permanently. Caleb agreed without argument. I think part of him was relieved to finally be free of the weight he'd been carrying. The next few weeks were brutal. I liquidated investments and took a loan against the company to raise the money, but we paid his creditors in full. Caleb moved into a small rental across town, starting fresh, with nothing but determination I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. I destroyed all the evidence he'd created, formatting that USB drive and burning the forged documents in our backyard fire pit. As I watched those lies turn to ash, I thought about how close we'd both come to losing everything. The hardest part was learning to trust again. For months, every phone call made me wonder if he'd relapsed. Every time he seemed stressed, I watched for signs he was gambling. But slowly I began to see real changes. Caleb found work with a small residential contractor starting at the bottom, despite his management experience. He never complained, never asked me to intervene. He was rebuilding his reputation one honest day at a time. He attended Gamblers Anonymous religiously and eventually started sponsoring others. When he introduced me to his own sponsor, the man said something that stuck with me. Your son saved my life by showing me what rock bottom really looked like. It took almost a year before we could sit together without the weight of betrayal hanging between us. But gradually we rebuilt something new. Not the relationship we'd had before that was gone forever, something stronger built on honesty instead of assumptions. 3 years later, Caleb has his own small construction business. Nothing fancy, just residential repairs, but it's clean and honest work. We sometimes bid on the same projects, now competitors, instead of partners. Maybe it's better this way. Last Sunday he came for dinner, something we do monthly now. Sitting in the backyard where he'd once buried evidence of his betrayal, he told me about sponsoring a young man who reminded him of himself at his worst. I tell them all the same thing, Caleb said. The people who love you most are usually the ones you'll hurt worst when you're desperate. But if you're lucky, they might love you enough to help you find your way back. Looking at my son that evening, I realized something unexpected. Those bottles weren't just filled with lies and betrayal. They were also filled with love, twisted and desperate, but love nonetheless. A son's misguided attempt to save his father even while destroying him. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what someone did. It means choosing to love them enough to help them become better than their worst moment. It means setting boundaries while keeping doors open for redemption. Sometimes the people we love most will surprise us in the worst possible ways. But if we're strong enough to forgive, wise enough to set boundaries, and patient enough to wait, they might just surprise us again. That's what those buried bottles taught me. Sometimes our deepest betrayals come from our deepest love, and sometimes our greatest healing comes from choosing grace over grudges. As I sit here today reflecting on those bottles buried in my backyard, I've learned that betrayal stories like mine aren't just about the pain we endure, but about the grace we choose to give. God has a way of turning our deepest wounds into our greatest wisdom, and I believe He allowed me to discover Caleb's plan, not to destroy our relationship, but to save it. The lesson I want to share with you is this. When someone you love betrays you, you have two choices. You can let that betrayal define your story, or you can let God's love redefine theirs. I chose love, and it made all the difference. I know many of you watching this have your own betrayal stories, your own buried bottles of pain. Maybe you're grandparents like me sharing grandpa stories with little ones who look up to you. What legacy will you leave them? Will it be one of bitterness or one of forgiveness? God doesn't waste our pain. He uses it to teach us about His own heart, His own willingness to forgive us when we've buried our own evidence of failure in the backyard of our lives. Just as I chose to help Caleb despite his betrayal, our Heavenly Father chooses to help us despite ours. These grandpa stories we tell, these betrayal stories we survive, they all point to the same truth. Love wins when we let it. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life stories of forgiveness and hope. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for redemption. And tell me in the comments, what buried bottles are you ready to dig up and forgive?